Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Hello. Today we have a special treat. We are joined by Connie Zweig. We interviewed Connie last year, and her episode was one of our most listened to episodes for the year, so I'm really excited to introduce her in just a minute. Before I do, I just want to share that I will be running a women's retreat with fairy tales and yoga. It's a weekend retreat in central Pennsylvania, and it is the weekend of September 28th. So if you're interested in that, we have a few spots left, and you can go to my website, which is lisamarciano.com, and just click on Wellspring Women's Retreat. So I hope to see some of you there. And now, without further ado, Connie Zweig, PhD, is a retired therapist and co-author of Meeting the Shadow and Romancing the Shadow, two very important books. Her award-winning book, The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul, extends her work on the shadow into midlife and beyond, and explores aging as a spiritual practice. It won the 2022 Gold COVR Award, the 2022 Gold Nautilus Award, the 2021 American Book Fest Award, and the 2021 Best Indie Book Award for Best Inspirational Nonfiction. Her new book, Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path, The Dance of Darkness and Light in Our Search for Awakening, is available now. Connie has been doing contemplative practices for more than 50 years. She is a wife, stepmother, and grandmother. After all these roles, she's practicing the shift from role to soul. So, without further ado, here's our conversation with Connie. We hope you enjoy it.
Connie, it's so wonderful to see you. We so enjoyed our last talk with you, and we're excited to hear more about your book, Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path, The Dance of Darkness and Light in Our Search for Awakening. And Connie, I thought we could begin by just asking you what motivated you to write the book. What's the seed image, the source memory that the book rose out of?
Okay. Hi, Joseph, Lisa, Deb. Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about the new book and for having me back again. I have a very sweet memory of our first time together. So when I was 19, I was a student at Berkeley, and actually we were striking to close down the psychology department because they were killing rats.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so we were striking the building, and I saw this very cute guy, I'm 19, with this ponytail down all the way down his back to his butt. And he left the building. He started to walk down Telegraph Avenue, if you know Berkeley at all. And so I followed him. I walked out, and we started talking. And we talked all the way walking across Berkeley. And it turns out that he wouldn't go out with me unless I learned meditation, transcendental meditation. So the following week, because I liked him, I went and got initiated into TM. And I became aware during that time of this longing in my soul. It was as if my soul, the deepest part of me, had a yearning that woke up when I started meditating or emerged into consciousness. And I realized when I looked back that I had actually always had that. I just didn't recognize it, and so I stuffed it. But I began to remember times in my childhood where I would kind of reach out. As a child, you think God. And so that spiritual yearning, I came to call the holy longing, based on a poem by Goethe. And as I meditated through the years, I left the TM movement a few years later and learned other kinds of meditation. But as I did practices through the lifespan, I began to realize that that yearning was guiding me. That if I attuned to it, it was actually leading me to teachers, to practices, to communities. I wrote my dissertation about it, looking at all the different schools of psychology and how they would describe or explain spiritual yearning. So it's kind of been a lifelong theme for me. Jung might call it the call of the self. Others might call it the call to transcendence, or the soul's search for the beloved, or the yearning for the divine. There are all these different names for it. But I began to realize that it was kind of a central experience and theme for me. And so meeting the shadow on the spiritual path is about what happens when we recognize that yearning in ourselves and we follow it. And all the positive, ecstatic experiences we can have. And then also it can go awry and it can lead us to meeting the shadow in ourselves, in our teachers, in our communities.
Now, Connie, when you say that it can lead us awry, and then we find ourselves meeting our own shadow or the shadow of the community in the teacher, does that suggest that a true spiritual path should not involve shadow, or that shadow work is somehow not congruent with spiritual work?
Such a good question. I'm so glad you caught what I said there. So, no, we meet the shadow, we're on the path. And the common misperception is then we're off the path. Why? Because we have this naive conception of spirituality as all sweetness and light. Oh, if I meditate, everything's going to be great. Or if I go into analysis, everything's going to be great. All my problems will be solved. Or if I do my prayer and go to church, it will all be good. No. Meeting the shadow in all kinds of different ways is part of the path. And if you read the myths in every tradition, or you read the teachings in all the mystical traditions, you find the dark night of the soul, the via negativa. And so thank you for catching my use of awry. It feels like it's gone awry, but actually it's a different aspect of being on the path.
Yeah. I've been thinking about the phrase that people use about taking the spiritual bypass and elevating or seeking to elevate up. And bypass what you cite in the book as basically sort of basic lines of development, that there's cognitive development and emotional development, psychological development, moral, aesthetic, that we can't just aim straight for transcendence without paying attention to other aspects of human development.
Yeah, so spiritual bypass has kind of been popularized to mean that we're using our spirituality to bypass our emotional problems and our emotional or psychological line of development. And so that's what I mean by if we just meditate, everything's going to be great. And we will be healed. We'll heal our trauma. We'll heal our history. Yeah. And, after decades of meditation, people find that's not the case. Yeah. They're still suffering. So I found this framework of lines of development, which is from Ken Wilber, to be really helpful. Because one of the other myths about awakening is that it's global. That if we wake up spiritually, every other part of us will suddenly become Einstein, right? Will be a genius. And if that were the case, then why would we see all these teachers acting out their shadows? So the experiences of awakening or non-duality, we can talk about this, all the different names for that, don't necessarily mean that the shadow is eliminated. And they don't necessarily include moral development, which is one of the lines you didn't mention, Deb. That's so much a part of this book. So my question is, how do we embrace our spiritual development while including our psychological development, our moral development, our cognitive development? It's a lot of inner work, right? It's a lot to focus on.
You know, if I can just bring this to Jung for a second, I think this is why he was very emphatic that the goal of individuation is not perfection, but wholeness. And wholeness includes having darkness, having shadow. And he says, you know, I wouldn't have any substance if I didn't have shadow. So he's very clear that you can do shadow work. You can become aware of your shadow. You can, to some extent, withdraw your projections, but you can't ever do that completely. And it's sort of a practice.
Oh, yeah.
It's not a kind of one and done.
Oh, very much so. Lifelong. I call it cultivating shadow awareness. So in our context now about religion and spirituality, how do we find a teacher or join a community with shadow awareness? And this is, you know, one of Jung's greatest gifts. How do we do that so that we can see the red flags and not go into denial? So that we can slowly recognize our projections, what we're giving away to this charismatic figure. Again, whether it's an analyst or a guru, a swami, a roshi, a priest, a minister, right? What are we giving away in the projection that really belongs in our own treasury? And as we learn to reclaim our projections, how does that change that sacred relationship? What does that look like then? Because it's typically based on a lot of projection.
So it seems like there are several things on the table. One is the choice of a spiritual path, which has to do with a philosophy, which can be both intellectual and moral and lifestyle and a number of things. But it also would then include a kind of spiritual technology. Do we meditate in a certain way? Do we learn to master the body or concentration in a different way? And then a third piece is the representative of the tradition. And I think all those things sit, you know, in different areas of consideration for sure.
Yeah.
So I think what I'm hearing you say is that people can have their first introduction to a path through the representative of the tradition. And I suppose if somebody is not coming in with a lot of background, that they really wouldn't know how to evaluate the representative. And so consequently, there's a lot of mythology and projection and idealization, perhaps, a lot of unconscious material because they're new. They're new to what's happening there. So how would you help somebody enter into an evaluative process so that they could go in perhaps with their eyes more open?
Well, I don't know that I would sequence it, Joseph, and say it's about the teacher first, because I think it's different for different people. People who are really driven by the need to belong are looking for community first. And people who are really driven by, more introverted people who are driven by the, what we call the holy longing, they're more driven to find the practice first, I think. Some people, you know, with unmet childhood needs or desire for a mentor or a projection and as an idealization are, you know, going to put the teacher first. That's true. But I don't know that that's universal. I think that, so these different unmet needs are going to motivate people differently. in terms of how do we help people move from this kind of spiritual naivete, this blind faith, denial of the shadow, to a more mature, highly developed spirituality. The second half of the book is about what I call spiritual shadow work. And it's really using depth psychology and its gifts to reimagine our spiritual lives. So how do we recognize what we've projected in a personal parental projection or in an archetypal projection onto a clergy person? How do we identify what we've given away? If we're practicing yoga and we give away our light, this guy carries so much light and I don't. Or this woman carries so much compassion and I don't feel that, right? And then it turns out that the yoga teacher is a sexual predator, which has happened. Then what happens to that student? There's a devastating, traumatic sense of betrayal of trust. With spiritual shadow work, they then begin to reclaim their beliefs, their doubts. Because if you're in blind faith in relation to someone, you're not allowing the doubts to emerge. You're stuffing them into the shadow. You want certainty. In some cases, people want to be told what to do and how to live, like you said, lifestyle. People come in with these dependency needs, and they want to be told how to live. And then they see this teacher, shaming someone or physically abusing someone or, threatening people if they don't obey. So then we're in this tension between what we observe and what we wish we were seeing, right? The reality and the fantasy about the circumstances. And that's a kind of tension that can lead to either someone is able to turn within and self-reflect and allow the doubts and also the authentic feelings that have been stuffed, the intuition that's been stuffed, begin to allow those qualities to come forth. Or they defend, they go back into denial, and what I call spiritual rationalization. My teacher's an alcoholic, but the alcohol doesn't affect him the way it affects everybody else. When Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche died of alcoholism, people said, no, that wasn't what killed him. They denied it even at his death.
Wow.
So there are a lot of examples of the defenses that come up that really depth psychology can help us understand and break through in order to move toward a more mature spirituality. So let's say it's our intuition that we've stuffed, because you asked me how do we guide people to do this. If we've really buried our intuitive faculty or our bodily kinesthetic sense of things. I had all these women tell me, my body kept telling me it was dangerous, but I didn't want to know. My body knew this man was dangerous, but I denied it. So when you begin to allow those bodily cues or the intuitive function to come back, and you have that information in front of you, then you have decisions to make, right? And so, and I'm not prescribing a universal recipe for everybody because this is very individual. So some people will do, like Joseph, you divided up these teacher, technique, and community. Some people will say, okay, I'm going to leave the community and just continue to practice a technique on my own. And they find a solution there. Some people say, no, I'm going to stay. I'm going to become a whistleblower and try to redesign the community and make it safe for everybody. Some people are going to say, This is too painful. It's too traumatic. I don't want anything to do with any of it anymore. And they separate not just from that teacher and community, but from all spiritual life, because they're so disillusioned that there's a loss of faith that they can't recover. So I really feel that our practices from depth psychology can assist those folks, that by doing the psychological inner work, we can begin to feel our holy longing again. We can begin to hear the call to move beyond ego as we do the healing work for the ego, for the trauma, for the PTSD. A lot of PTSD comes from this. There's a group of scholars right now called the Religion and Sexual Abuse Project, who are looking at sexual assault in a lot of Buddhist communities. This is really widespread now. And you know, so what I wanted to do with the book was say, look, we have all these tools from Jung, from depth psychology. We have shadow work. Let's try to apply some of that material in this context. The Me Too movement didn't do that, right? The Me Too movement was so fantastic, but it stayed in the secular arenas of the workplace and the military and so on. It really didn't go into the churches and the spiritual communities. So I'm saying, you know, let's really open this up. Let's take these secrets around these communities out of the shadow and offer people guidance, offer people help, recovery.
You know, I'm so taken with how this circles around the central importance of doing shadow work. No matter what realm we're in, there's just ultimately no avoiding ourselves, you know, in the final analysis. And Jung says somewhere, and I'm paraphrasing, that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid meeting themselves. But I'm also aware from having read your book, which I just have to say to everybody out there is a don't miss book. Go get it. It's really powerful. Is the inherent dangers in hierarchy. And whether, you know, of all the religious practices that you mention, and you really cover the waterfront, when there is hierarchy that is built in to a senior person, a master, a guru, you know, some external world person who is the authority, that, you know, I've kind of taken away, maybe that should be something at first just to reflect on, of how much of myself do I surrender and do I give away?
You know,
Well, and that's a fascinating subject right there, because we have hierarchies in all kinds of organizations, right?
Yes,
you could
we
talk
do.
about the CEO, and I think some of the same things always apply, don't they? So there's just something about human organizations that have this tendency toward fallibility,
I
because
also
the shadow
think that
is always there.
hierarchy
That's so
does not
true.
inherently imply surrender. It can also imply cooperation. So we come to somebody who says, I know a body of knowledge, techniques, I have a skill. Someone comes and says, I wish to be a student. So there is inherently the hierarchy of the one who knows and the one who wants to learn. And if that is a contract, if that is a collaborative cooperation and people
Yeah.
agree upon it, then no one is being forced to surrender to anything, but they are admitting that they don't know and want to know. So what I think you might be leaning into, Deb, is that hierarchy is a way of both cooperating and distributing resources. When is that constructive, and when does it open a door to something that shouldn't be there, that becomes harmful.
Yeah. Well, I think we're leaning into the archetypal substrate here of the teacher-student or CEO and whoever is underneath him or her, the priest or clergy person, parishioner, maybe even the analyst and the analysand.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think there's an extra sort of energy charge, as if we've taken 110 volts and jacked it up to 220, when it's in a religious domain, because then it exceeds the bounds of, let's say, the workplace. It grabs hold of something, well, that you're talking about, Connie. Maybe we're coming full circle to the holy longing of that this is about my soul, not just what I do from 9 to 5.
Yes, it's more. It has a more archetypal dimension to it.
Yeah.
Just as Jung, remember when he uncovered that his client was trying to turn him into a god?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what's happening in these relationships of the sacred. It's not happening so much in the corporation or the military, that dimension. I mean, there's always projection, right? There's always projection. We can't help that. It's how we're built. But this other dimension of projecting God or the divine or all-knowing or all-powerful happens more commonly in the spiritual dimension. And I think that it's hard to avoid hierarchies for that reason. So my concern is more about how the systemic hierarchies are colluding with shadow behaviors. So, for example, I tell a lot of stories in chapter 5 about the many, many gurus who are acting out their shadows, and teachers and clergy. But I also tell some stories about situations where they're doing shadow work and trying to recreate new systems and deal with hierarchy. So there was a scandal at the LA Zen Center where the Roshi was having sex with students. People found out. The whole thing blew up. I think he was 100 years old at the time. And what happened was this female Roshi stepped in and she completely redesigned the systems. She tried to eliminate the hierarchies. She had them, instead of facing the wall to meditate, face each other. She redesigned the communication systems and actually taught them shadow work. She called it shadow work. She actually redefined how men and women would work together. I mean, she really reimagined how the Zendo could operate. Now, in other traditions, the reason that's so difficult is that people actually sign vows. In Tibetan Buddhism, you have to sign a vow never to criticize your Rinpoche, your Lama. You have to sign a vow. It's like an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement in the workplace, just like that. And then there's a lot of threats around it if you don't sign the vow, which is an ancient tradition in Tibetan Buddhism, and never criticize the teacher, then such and such will happen. So how do you eliminate hierarchy with that built into the system? There are individual teachers who have stepped down, acknowledged that they did harm, like Brew Joy. Andrew Cohen now has a new book out about the harm that he did, recognizing his narcissism as a teacher and trying to make amends with people. So there are some examples of people doing this, but it's rare compared to the epidemic of abuse that's going on in these communities.
And
I feel like, go ahead, Deb.
Okay. Well, I'm thinking that then there are, in a way, two kind of categories. One is the personal teacher, to whom one gives authority, but the other is institutional hierarchy. that it's just built in, and there are many organizations that have institutionalized it, from parishioners up to clergy people, like priests in the Catholic Church.
Look at the Catholic Church.
Oh, look at the Catholic Church.
I mean, the scandals since the 80s continue to this day. Dioceses are still paying out for childhood sexual abuse. And systemically, as far as we know, nothing has changed.
God. I'm thinking that, it might be interesting to see where we could reduce hierarchies. But in some sense, some people come to these communities because they want hierarchy. As you said before, sometimes people want to be told what to do. And it seems to me that idealization, which is an important part of lots of different growth processes, but there's always a way that it's also an abdication of personal responsibility. Because when I project wisdom onto the analyst or the teacher or the guru, then I'm sort of relieving myself of the responsibility to have my own wisdom or my own intuition or my own kind of discernment process around that. I'm just going to receive what I'm being fed. This is something that definitely happens in the Jungian community. I mean, I see people come, for example, to our seminar. I mean, I think this happened to me to a certain extent. You come there feeling like you're entering the Holy Temple if you've been interested in Jung and you've been reading Jung, and you get in there. And I remember my first seminar, I think I floated home. I was so happy to be there and be talking about these ideas. It was just so stimulating. You get kind of flush, and there's this, this slight, inflation that goes along with being exposed to these ideas. And then eventually you realize, that this person doesn't really know their stuff very well. That person never comes super well prepared. This other person, has some kind of disappointing personal habits or whatever it is. And I think that's just part of it. But especially when you enter training, there's this way that you think that, the analysts have all done all this work. And so they're individuated. And I'm just a lowly acolyte. And I want to tell a story. There had been some kind of ethical violations within our professional society. There'd been some worse ones in our history, but more recently when we were in training, they were fairly innocuous. I don't remember exactly what they were, but they weren't, super explosive or anything, but worrying enough that the society wanted to have a process. And so there was a committee, the ethics committee, formulated this afternoon-long process that we were all involved in, where we were broken up into groups with analysts and training candidates and to discuss things. And then I remember Pat Barry stood up and said, I kind of don't get it. She said, when we were in training, we just understood that we had to hold the analyst's shadows. And I remember it just really knocked me sideways when she said that, and I sort of got it. Not that I think that analysts should go around training institutes not being responsible for their shadow. More that when you're a trainee or an acolyte or a spiritual disciple, it's not really okay to just surrender your own judgment and to not hold in awareness that the other people around you, guess what? They're all people.
Yeah, it reminds me of Jung's statement, I'm glad I'm Jung, not a Jungian.
It does seem really important
Yes.
to me
Yeah.
to clarify the difference between shadow and unsanctioned behavior, because they're not the same thing. So for Jung, he was very clear that shadow meant something that is not in consciousness, which could be the best parts of someone or the most shocking parts of someone based on the culture that they live in. So what I'm hearing in the conversation, and sometimes I wondered in the book, Connie, that shadow and hidden from public knowledge have actually been conflated, and they're really quite different. So again, shadow means that somebody is holding material that they have no conscious relationship to. And they may be making decisions, have feelings, fantasies, behaving for reasons that they do not understand. So, when we talk about empowering people to police their leaders, their religious icons, and to discover whether there is unsanctioned behavior, and then confront them and punish them, that's not shadow work. It may be moral work, and it may be really justifiable and necessary, but I don't know that I would call that shadow work. I would call that enforcement of moral and legal and ethical expectations that are normal in a culture. So shadow work is more the thing that isn't known. And when you leaned into saying that we come to a spiritual teacher and we don't know that we're projecting an idealized father complex, or we don't know that there's a God image inside of us that is seeking a screen to be revealed into, whether it's a system, a community, or an individual. That's, of course, the shadow work, and because it's the mystery that one could become aware of it. So it seems that the separation of those things is important, and both have validity.
But
Go ahead.
Let me just try to play with that for a second, Joseph, because what I'm thinking is, I think there probably are some just straight up sociopaths that become attracted to this, and they're doing what they're doing kind of with full consciousness. But I also think there's something about being in a position of power and accepting the projections of other people, the idealized projections of other people, that can result in an inflation that is difficult to escape, even when you know that can happen and you're trying to avoid it. And I am speaking from personal experience. This is part of being an analyst,
Yes.
is that people project things onto you. And, you can do your supervision, and you can try to just be as honest with yourself as possible. But one can fall into, I think, shadowy places because you're under the influence of that very delicious inflation that comes with being, the guru, as it were. So I do think that is shadowy, because it's maybe not that you're completely unconscious of it, but you have an impaired relationship with it.
Because I think it's so important to this topic. Again, do you mean shadowy as in culturally unsanctioned? Or do you mean shadowy in as much as I don't know why I'm doing what I'm doing, and I'm not even aware of why I'm doing it?
I'm talking about when those two things overlap.
Okay. Yeah. And there's a little formulaic thing that might help us out here with shadow of how we deny things, and the acronym for it is BASK, BASK. That we may know something behaviorally, we may know something in our sensate, physical functioning, we may know something from our feelings, and we may know something in knowledge. But I may know something intellectually, that I really shouldn't do X or Y or Z, but I don't feel it inside me. I feel like maybe just this one time it'll be okay. So that we split off those four functions, and so we may kind of sort of know something, but not in a fully felt way. So that takes shadow from being just altogether unconscious to being fragmented, split, and partially unconscious. And then what Lisa said rings true of then, we're susceptible to inflation and taking on idealized projections, which I have to say, I hope with all the rigorous training that a depth psychoanalyst undergoes, the hope is that we keep that in awareness and that the work is for and in and with our analysand. It is not being downloaded from us
This goes
to
to what
another
Connie had
person.
said early on, which I found really interesting, and it's aligned with what you're saying, Deb, is that all four functions are struggling towards individuation. And someone, for instance, someone could be highly
Yeah.
individuated in their thinking function in as much as they feel profoundly free to consider and think any number of things, to let the mind in that mercurial way travel to any concept or even imagine any possibility in a way that is held lightly, that there isn't a tremendous amount of unconscious material in it. And at the same time, as you were saying, Connie, somebody's sensate function can be full of fantasy and archetypal material and unmediated childhood trauma that then guides the body or interferes with the body's ability to sense and feel what is accurate. So I think that's quite true. And as you said, a spiritual teacher might have an experience of God realization, as you were saying, Connie, of cosmic consciousness, an experience particular, maybe an intuitive individuation, while the other functions are still mired in complexes and confusion. So I think that's right on, Deb, and that shadow can come in, which means unconscious material can come in through any of those other doors.
And that is how, to loop it back to what you were saying, Joseph, I think, we can say that certain behaviors are unsanctioned. And they absolutely are. And in some way, they're also in shadow, because they're not fully conscious.
And perhaps the
in
drives
some way.
behind the behaviors are what's hidden. The needs behind the behavior, as you said, Lisa, the unconscious inflation that then charges
Definitely.
or makes a behavior that's questionable seem feasible or even positive in a certain way.
So then we add the dimension of culture, which, collective shadow. So, for example, there was a Tibetan Buddhist teacher named Kalu Rinpoche who died, several years ago. Actually, it was probably a couple decades ago. And they believed that he was reborn in this young boy who they also called Kalu Rinpoche. And he has come to the West now to teach. And he has come out and said there's sexual abuse going on in the monasteries in Tibet and Nepal. And maybe that's an explanation for some of the sexual assault that's going on with these teachers in the West. So that seems to me, on top of the misogyny that they learn in monasteries that are supposed to be celibate. So that seems to me to be another layer of shadow material that then gets acted out in this culture shock. When they come to the West, the women are scantily dressed and really liberated and, right, individuated and full of self-expression, right? And there's this clash of their own personal shadow material, as Joseph's saying, they're completely unaware of these aspects of themselves, like a sexual drive, which was prohibited in the monastery, or sexism and male superiority, which isn't ever discussed, so that's in the shadow, right? So there's all these layers, and then they come here and they confront this completely different situation where, yes, the behaviors are unwelcome, and not only that, and harmful, really destructive, and the identification, the unconscious identification with their powerful positions leads them to feel not inflated, as Lisa said, but also entitled. I think there's a lot of narcissism because they're told from birth that they're special. From the minute they're born, they're special. So then they feel entitled, so they sit on golden thrones and they have these golden Buddhas. And can there be consent when there's that power differential, that authority differential, that unconscious projection and idealization, all those cultural differences? I mean, what is consent in that situation?
Yeah.
So, and ironically, there have been women who have married their spiritual teachers and say that there's no issues. But, we don't know what the power dynamics are in those marriages, right? We have no idea. So I think I'm agreeing with all of you, which is this is really complex and it's really nuanced. And I hope that I don't conflate those two different points. And I hope that people understand that I tried to break down the acting out of shadow into the arenas of power, sex, and money, because I started with that way back in Romancing the Shadow. And I think those three areas are really sort of general directions in which personal shadow erupts.
Yeah.
And even though it erupts into behavior, people are still unconscious of why or where it's coming from, still say, that's not who I am, so they deny it. So from my point of view, it's still shadow material, right? So if they're acting out around power, sex, and money, I actually just had someone tell me a story of his teacher started out just asking for tithing, and then asked for a portion of people's income. And then when he found out that students' parents had died, asked for the estate.
Oh my God.
Right? And if you don't give me the estate, then you lose your chance to be enlightened, or to go to heaven, or whatever the language is, right? So financial abuse is also a big shadow issue in here. So to me, if we in terms of what Joseph was asking, if we look at that teacher or clergy person doing that kind of financial coercion, is that a shadow issue? I mean, he's intentionally wanting the money, asking for the money, right? But he's unaware of his own greed. He's unaware of his own motivation. He's unaware of how he's harming this person he promised to guide. So is that a shadow issue? So from my point of view, it is. From my point of view, I think we can still call it that, because so much around it is unconscious.
And I think that's so important, Connie, because I get letters from my university trying to manipulate me into leaving my estate to them. That happens. Oh, open your mail.
Really?
Harvard writes to people and says, please contact our estate bequeathment entitlement program. We'd love to have you leave us something in your will. I mean, this is a thing that happens. There's all all of the behaviors we're talking about happen in all realms. But I love that you're saying is that if we are privileged to be in a system where inner work is inherently invited and prioritized, then all of those decisions in treatments need to be thought over and explored on multiple levels so that everything is transparent. And this is where I think sometimes there's a rub.
That's right.
Because Jung was incensed by conventional morality. He felt that it was suffocating people. Freud felt that it was cutting them into pieces and making them horrifically symptomatic, that there is so much of the instinctive world that needs breathing space that does not fit into the 10 rules that our family may have given us. So there is one trouble with the idea of sanctioned rules. There's another consideration of evaluating harm, which is secondary to whether or not people think we look good. we're dressing right or saying the right words in that way. But for Jung, my understanding was that it is the transparency that is important. For instance, in Osho's ashram, there was such transparency about free sex and sexuality. Everybody knew that going in. You actually, this was before my time, but people were expected to take an STD test, an HIV test, and submit it at the desk when they were registering. Nobody was surprised that sexual invitations were going to be exposed everywhere. Is that wrong?
But there was not
Exactly.
transparency about guns, about his drug use and eventual addiction. There were a lot of
We're
secrets
just talking
in
about
that
the realm of
community.
sex, but there was still a reaction in American culture
Yeah.
to want to demonize that, even though it was transparent, and to question whether anybody should have been involved
Very
because it
true.
shocks, what we think of cultural norms are. But I take your point, as you said, all
Yeah.
the other hidden things, which have come up in other exposés of guns and all kinds of things that are horrific going on. The paranoia,
Yes, you became
right, which
paranoid.
often is driven by unconscious conflicts.
Yeah.
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 I'd like to ask for your comments, Connie. We've been circling around it of there is power, sex, and money. Of how often these kinds of abuses really devolve into sexual abuse. And of course, we've mentioned it with the Me Too movement. And it's rife in Eastern and in certainly in the Roman Catholic Church. And you said somewhere in the book that power and sex go hand in hand, and I'm hoping you'll elaborate a bit on that.
Deb, I have no idea how frequent this is. I mean, I don't have any way to know because I don't think there are any stats on it, and partly that's because it's so secret. So I have a friend who's a clinician who works in the Hasidic communities in the Northeast, who said there is so much sexual abuse you wouldn't believe it.
Yeah.
I think that, fundamentalism, whether it's Christian or Mormon or Jewish, I think that fundamentalism breeds a lot of the issues that we're talking about, because people become unconsciously identified with these beliefs and easily manipulated.
Yeah.
So I know that when I was researching the book, I was very, very distressed to learn, how widespread not only sexual, but just all of this abuse really is in these spiritual communities. And I think that we can assume there's a certain amount of it in all of the conventional religious communities as well, whether it ever comes to light or not. And, I was looking for patterns because the book isn't, you don't have to believe or not believe anything for the book. It's not based on beliefs. It's not based on your denomination. It's not anti any denomination. And so I was looking for kind of deeper patterns across denominations. And one of the things I saw was that the patterns are a lot like alcoholic families. If you think about it, right? There's the kind of narcissistic father who abuses power. There's a special person who's kind of chosen for abuse. Sometimes there's substance abuse. Sometimes other members are colluding with the abuser. There are
There's the enablers.
Sorry?
There are the enablers.
They're the enablers. There are secrets that act like glue holding the whole thing together. And, and what's it holding together? It's holding together the family persona, You know, this is not who we are. We're really a good family. Nobody else has to know. And that's what happens in these communities. They develop a persona. And part of what the material that goes into the shadow is determined by what the persona is about. So in my 20s, when I was in TM, everybody kind of wore this beatific smile. And it was very unconscious. But I noticed it after I left. Because what had gone into the shadow? Grief, anger, sexuality, passion. Because we were supposed to be like little bliss ninnies. That was the term that was used. In order to get more people to meditate. So there's this persona that develops in every community that really shapes what gets stuffed away. And as the material in the shadow starts to come out, then there's this, conflict between, well, who am I? I mean, I had so many people say to me, if my teacher really did that, my whole life would be meaningless. My whole life would be meaningless. I wouldn't know who I am. So I can't believe that.
Yeah.
So there's this massive identity crisis that happens. And the capacity to shift from an observer of abuse to a whistleblower in this situation is really rare. That's why we don't see people talking about it, People don't have the resilience or the agency or the empowerment to actually say, this is wrong, this is abuse, I'm calling the police, or whatever it is. And so it just continues. It just continues in all these situations. And I'm hoping to draw people with this book who are in these communities, who are teachers, ready to do some self-reflection, who are students or believers or disciples, ready to do some self-reflection. In my last workshop, there were several former Episcopal priests who were really ready to talk about what's going on with them. That was really gratifying. And so we'll see, we'll see if it reaches people and if it helps. And, I'm reminded of Jung's, I don't know if I put this in the book or not, but remember when Jung wrote about secret societies? That remember that?
I can't remember where, but it's a transitional place.
Exactly.
Basically. Yeah.
It's a trend. He said, secret societies kind of can help us separate and individuate out of our families, but they're not the end point. They're not where we want to land. And I think, in our culture, this kind of worship of individual autonomy creates its own shadow of dependency. So if most of us are kind of walking around unconscious of our dependency needs, and most of us didn't get them met in childhood, right? Or in adolescence. So if we're walking around with that, it makes us susceptible to charismatic teachers. And if the teachers have these other needs for adoration and devotion and obedience, it makes them susceptible to carry the projection and not return it to the student.
Yeah.
And as much as they mouth it, like I remember Swami Muktananda used to say, Guru, self, and God are one. He never gave it back, right? He never said to people, you have a guru within you.
Yeah.
Because he held the projection. Yeah. So I think there's a certain setup here that's very hard to pierce in the psyche.
Yeah. I go back to the story you alluded to earlier of Jung, who was aware that he had a huge projection placed on him by an analysand.
Yeah, Miss Miller.
Okay.
That was the
And
story.
And she, if I'm remembering this right, drew a picture of him as this great god standing in a wheat field,
Yes.
carrying her in his arms. And Jung had tried to disabuse her of this to no avail. When he got that she had projected this superhuman, godlike power onto him, he was able to accept that it was her projection and neither take it on personally. He did not identify with it, but nor did he try to refute it. But in the course of their work, she could take the projection back. And it seems to me that that's something to aspire to, is that people do have dependency needs, and we do have innocence, and we do idealize, and how to hold that as belonging to the other person.
And I think that psychoanalysis is maybe a little bit unique and different
we
from
hope
some
so.
of these other, we hope so, these other communities that we've been talking about, because we do have this explicit awareness of projection, and we are taught and trained that we have to accept the projection for some period of time, but then give it back to the person when
Yeah.
they're ready, which is, easier said than done, and we can all get caught up in that. But at least there's some awareness of it. Connie, I want to just take a second and note that this is a new edition of the book. Is that right?
Yeah.
Would you like to tell us about what's been changed and
Yeah,
kind
this
of
book
just tell
has
us a
evolved.
little bit more about that?
It's evolved, yeah. So there were some earlier editions. This edition has a lot of new material that's both a long new preface that sets it up post Me Too movement, because that has been a big cultural event. Lot of shifts in identity, the nature of identity that have gone on in the culture. A lot of new reports of allegations of abuse that weren't in earlier books. And I would say, most of all, my own understanding of this and my own experience has grown. And I really wanted to share that with readers and expand the insights and the framework that I had written earlier. I've had, I have continued to learn new practices, some occasionally find new teachers, although that probably won't happen again, and have my own experiences of what I'm writing about, as well as new people to interview so that there are new anecdotes. There's also a group now called Association for Spiritual Integrity, which meets online if you're interested in that, Association for Spiritual Integrity, to discuss a lot of these
put that in the
issues
show notes.
with, and there are a lot of spiritual teachers in that group. I think that one of the other big cultural shifts that's happened, we're all so acutely aware of the crises that we're in, the collective and interconnected crises that we're living through. And at the same time, there are many people experiencing advanced stages of awareness, higher levels of consciousness. And these things are happening simultaneously. Buddha at the Gas Pump is a podcast about all of these folks who are having these states of consciousness of non-duality or awakening or enlightenment, whatever you call it. And there are about like 700 people interviewed on there now. And it's gone global, so there are tens of thousands of people watching everyone. And I think that, so none of that was happening in the last edition. So the nature of awakening and enlightenment has many different, more complex meanings now that we can explore. And that just seemed really important to me. So for that reason, the book has been really revised.
And when will this new edition be available?
Oh, it's
Want to tell
out.
us a little bit more about that?
Yeah.
It's out. Okay.
So
Great.
wherever you buy books, it's on Amazon or Barnes and Noble or wherever you buy books. Yeah.
I think one of
Well,
the
we are
great gifts of the book is actually maybe a little bit underneath the surface, which is that the holy longing, as you've termed it, turns us back to ourselves. It's not that there's anything illegitimate or not worthy about such a longing, and that it's in you and you and you and you. It's not out there, it's in here.
Yes, it's the whispering, the restless whispering that guides us as seekers. And if you're aware that you're a seeker, you can learn to attune to that and allow it to guide you. Also,
And I think, Deb, that's such a beautiful point because, I mean, I think this is your whole message, Connie, is
Yes.
this wounding that can happen can cut us off from this source.
yes.
And I've worked with people like that, and it is a hard place to be, to have no access to that contact with the numinous.
Yes.
Because you've been wounded in this way. And so, Deb, I think what you're lifting up is so important, that shouldn't be thrown out,
Yes.
even if you've had a horribly wounding experience.
That's
so,
right.
Connie, this is really important work.
And holding both sides, holding that danger and risk that this person's shadow will act out, and at the same time holding the beauty, the transmissions of wisdom, the beauty of the practices. This is not like, the cult books are about get out and adapt to conventional society and be normal. That's not the message here. The message is that our individuation continues. Meeting the shadow is part of the path. It doesn't mean we're off the path. And we can learn to cultivate shadow awareness so that we can move out of naivete to more mature, more nuanced, and more conscious relationship with ourselves.
Yes. And find the real gold.
And find the gold. Thank you, Deb. I want to also issue an invitation to our listeners, if you guys don't mind.
Oh, please.
I'm forming groups for people who want to do spiritual shadow work together. So they're free.
What a great service.
They're free, they're
That's great.
online, and they're organized by time zone. And so if you would like to read the book with other people and do the practices together, just shoot me a quick email, conniezweig@gmail.com, and please put spiritual shadow work in the subject line so I catch it, and your time zone, and I'll connect you. There are groups forming all the time, so I'll connect you with other people, and you can do this together and support each other.
That's amazing. What a resource.
What a wonderful service.
And what a gift.
And
that
I
you're
also,
giving people.
I don't know if this is out of place, but I also want to say we have 3 stellar therapists here with me, clinicians, who can do this work with you. And so if you're listening and you feel like you've experienced religious trauma or spiritual betrayal, you can also reach out to Lisa and Joseph and Deb for guidance.
That's very generous of you.
Well, thank you
so
Connie.
much, Connie.
Yeah, we're all at this place. Thank you for all the work you've done with shadow. That's been a gift for so many people, and now this part of your work with dealing with spiritual shadow.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you all. Thank you for this opportunity.
We look forward to having you on again.
Yes.
Thank you.
So here's our dream for today. It comes from a 44-year-old woman who works as a preschool teacher. And she titled it Octopus à deux. Two dreams with repeated octopus figure 6 months apart. So this is interesting because we get to look at a little dream series. So the first dream. Someone is going to eat the eye of an octopus. The octopus is almost dead, blackish purple in color. The eye is a pearl set into the middle of the octopus's head. Someone is trying to pry it out. The people trying to pry out the octopus's eye are dressed in white hazmat or lab suits, with heads covered and faces obscured. The setting is some sort of cold and sterile laboratory, and the octopus is on a lab table with no water. I have a feeling of great sadness for the octopus, as the octopus grasped the pearl eye firmly with its tentacles, resisting the prying, and the person in the lab coat cannot get the eye out. Feelings in the dream were sadness and compassion for the octopus, also vulnerability and awe. So here's the second dream. I am in some sort of rundown aquarium with my close friend Becca, who I have known for over 20 years. The ground is wet, flooded a couple of inches, like the water has spilled from the tanks, none of which are filled completely. The animals are being neglected, not well cared for. Especially there is a large sort of monstrous-looking white octopus roiling around in one low, open-topped tank like a children's touch tank, roiling to show its undercarriage, all tentacles and suckers, and I imagine a monstrous squid-like maw inside. A patron is touching or interacting with the octopus, and the octopus appears to like it. I attempt to interact with the octopus, but it doesn't want me to. It rears up a bit and scares me off. It's not ready yet. The feelings in this dream are anxiety, revulsion, curiosity, and a feeling of exclusion or disappointment. And here's what she notes. She says, I'm married, 44-year-old mother of two, with an overall content and peaceful life that I've worked hard to build. I got sober about 7 years ago after many years of drug and alcohol abuse. I grew up in a very dysfunctional household with verbal and physical abuse, the verbal and emotional abuse continuing into adulthood. I am currently estranged from both parents who are divorced and one sister out of 3. I have very few memories before the age of about 10 and no memories at all in my childhood home with parents present. And also no memories of all of me in my childhood bedroom. I began having serious panic attacks after I got sober and eventually began EMDR therapy about 2 years ago. Let's see. She says the feelings in the dream are sadness and compassion for the octopus in the first dream, also vulnerability and awe. The feelings in the second dream are anxiety, revulsion, curiosity, a feeling of exclusion and disappointment. And she notes, I've always loved octopuses, though not obsessively so. But I associate them with the deep ocean, mysteriousness, intelligence, and playfulness, as well as vulnerability and hiding. So I'll just sort of say to start off with that I picked the dream earlier today, and I was struck by it. But reading it just now, I was so really overcome with sadness in that first dream. It's so sad.
I was thinking that these are dreams where the starting point for me is the feeling. And I felt, as you did, Lisa, of like, oh my gosh, this image of people trying to pry that octopus's eye out is really very intense and very, very sad because it's cruel. It's more than sad, it's cruel.
And the octopus is just trying to hold on.
Just trying to protect itself.
Although there are two ways to read it, right? Because, and I'm just trying to see when okay, so she started therapy about 2 years ago, and then she had this dream 6 months ago. So because the people trying to pry the eye out are wearing hazmat suits, they're there in some kind of almost clinical capacity. So, I mean, clearly there's something, there's a reference to childhood trauma, I think, in trying to pry the eye out. And the eye is like a pearl. I mean, it's the pearl of great price is a metaphor for the self. And at the same time, it could be an image of the therapeutic process, which can feel like, because our defenses are sort of attacked in a sense, or it can feel like they're being attacked, as the therapy asks us to open up and make ourselves more vulnerable.
Although I'm going to a couple of things. One of them is the imagery of the eye. And the seeing is often associated with consciousness. I mean, we have all sorts of casual phrases that reference that. I see what you mean. I see your point. And therapy is associated with raising consciousness. But on the other hand, there are myths, such as the famous one of Oedipus, where he is blinded, so that external world vision, it's a metaphor for that becoming internal world vision. So that's a good point that you raise. And that would be a good question for an analyst to raise, or for her to bring to her process of, is it related at all to her therapeutic process?
And I think what I'm just saying is that I mean, certainly it is, I think, especially Deb, because you and I have had both such a strong feeling reaction to it, I think it is first and foremost a trauma-related image. But there is a way that when we've had trauma and we enter a therapeutic process, it can feel, and that's thunder, I don't know if you guys can hear it. It can feel almost re-traumatizing sometimes, because we're having to face this very difficult thing, and sometimes it can feel like someone's trying to pry our pearls from us.
Yeah, I think the dream is really complicated. Just as I think we're saying, on the affective level, it's there's so much pathos for this dying creature, and the clinical indifference with which it's being engaged, that something is being harvested from this denizen of the deep. Yeah. And it is fighting for its life, fighting for its bodily integrity, and there is whatever other agenda. The dream ego thinks someone is going to eat the eye of the octopus, but I have a tendency to want to set that aside, because there's no evidence in the actual action of the dream to tell us what they're going to do with it. But there is a very clinical harvesting of something from the unconscious, which is going to blind or kill this part of the unconscious. So if I step way, way back and step away from the pathos of it all, I can be aligned with your perspective, Lisa, that there is value in the unconscious, and things have to be separated. Not everything in the unconscious is useful for the ego to integrate. It may need to know about it. So sometimes there is a harvesting process from the unconscious, from our shadow, from the deep parts of us. So I can understand that dimension. I also understand the kind of dissecting process, because this is like being, in 10th grade biology and dissecting frogs and things, that taking things apart, which I had a lot of averse feelings about that myself, but is a way of knowing about something.
And
but the
analysis
ability,
actually
the split,
means, yeah.
the split between the two perspectives is what's missing. Is that the octopus is having its own experience, and we have a feeling about it. The clinician, the harvester in the lab suit is having their own experience. And what isn't in the dream is the symbol that's going to resolve the tension of those two things.
That's great,
it's an
Joseph.
impossible grip.
Yeah, that's really great.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that there is no resolution. And so we're going back and forth between the polarities. Is it this, is it that, does it mean this, does it mean that? Because the uniting symbol is not here. So maybe we should move to the second dream and see what has transpired.
Yes. Yeah. It does seem sort of important that the first dream ends with the person cannot get the eye out.
Well, it ends with them like both holding the eye, like fighting over it.
Right, and there is no resolution in this dream. It sort of ends with the image of tension. And then we have the second dream, which is, not a very nice place. It should be a nicer place. Aquariums, at least ideally, are places that we go to, for pleasure or enjoyment or entertainment and education. But this one has not been well kept, and the animals are not well kept. However, the octopus seems like he's having a good time.
The other thing I noticed right off the bat is that this time there's a dream ego in the dream.
Oh, yes, Deb. Good
In
point.
the first dream, it's as if she's, just observing somewhere, as if she's filming it.
Yeah.
That this is what I see. Now we have a dream ego there. I am in some sort of rundown aquarium.
And she's with a friend.
And she had better and better.
But the thing is, I don't think we have any associations for this friend, and that would be so interesting and revealing. I mean, I think she just says someone that she's known for a long time. But of course, we might wonder about whether Becca was a shadow figure. That's, not to be formulaic about it, but that might be a kind of first pass. But who Becca is and what Becca contains as an image would be really revealing here. But Dad, that's such a good point. Yes, that there's a dream ego in this one. Who acts.
And, relatively speaking, although this is just such an awful image of animals that are neglected and they don't have enough water, at least they're not being tortured.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
right.
They're being cared for, just not well.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
I just a little personal story association. I met a person by chance who was a volunteer at an aquarium, and his volunteer job was octopus enrichment.
Oh, for heaven's sake! there is.
And he
such
would
a
come
thing.
home from his volunteer. He would, because they are very intelligent, as I think we all know. He would come home from his volunteer stint with sucker marks all over his arm.
For heaven's sake!
Wow. The dance.
Yeah, and I guess there were like toys the octopus would play with, and I guess the octopus kind of got to know him, and I was like, oh my God, how can I do that job? I want to do that job.
Yeah.
So that this dream made me think of this. It's like the octopus has this affinity with this patron. And again, I'd be so curious who this patron is. Is this, does this patron remind the dreamer of anyone? What part of this dreamer is in good contact with this octopus and can be playful with
And
it?
of course, many people have seen the film My Octopus Teacher, where a diver does have a relationship with an octopus. So this is not, something that is dream material only. There really is a relationship that has been experienced. by a number of people, and it's been experienced by our dream octopus, because there is a patron who is touching, interacting, and the octopus appears to like it. Now, our dream ego, who decides that it would be good to get in on this, says, no, it doesn't want me to. It's not ready yet.
Not ready.
And that's the part of the dream that I underlined. The octopus part of her isn't ready yet.
Yeah, but it's certainly a lot closer
Absolutely.
than the first dream.
And there's desire to have a relationship. Jung is very clear that, the dream is we are the director, the playwright, the audience, the prompter, the critic. So all the parts of the dream are part of the dreamer. And it seems to me that this is a hopeful development overall.
It seems like the primary evolution has been with how the octopus is being related to, and there's the lab-suited person who's trying to dissect something and pry things out, harvest things, versus the caretaker who's tending, the octopus, trying to find a relationship for it, interacting with it. So the evolution of that is we're all curious about, and I feel very positive about. And also the idea that the octopus is scary to the ego. So it may be that in the first dream, this clinical attitude of, pulling the eye out is a way of also objectifying the unconscious and trying to master it and own it and eat it up, and
That's really
which
good.
doesn't work. They can't get the eye out. And so the ego now has to have a much more relational attitude.
Playful.
Less clinical.
Playful,
More playful.
attitude.
Right.
Yeah.
Exploratory.
I go back, I'm looping back to the first dream, and perhaps a return in this dream, in this way, of feeling on the part of the person observing the dream, that she's, the feelings in the dream are anxiety, revulsion, curiosity, exclusion, disappointment. So I'm kind of hypothesizing that because this dreamer could feel such a connection with the octopus and feel so bad for what was happening to it, that the return of those feelings have culminated in the second dream, where there's more connection and desire to be able to have a playful relationship with the octopus in the tank. I'm waiting for the third dream.
Right. Couple other things here. I think it's interesting that the octopus is in a touch tank, because that is usually for little kids. Right. So it kind of underscores, I think, that idea of approaching it playfully. And also, this is a very robust, healthy octopus. I mean, roiling implies a lot of, activity and life force. So this is a very different octopus than the octopus in the first dream.
I also just want to contextualize it in her recovery process. She's been sober, I think she said, for 20 years.
I think it was 7.
7, excuse me, that's right, 7 years. And in very traditional AA groups, there is historically an aversion to therapy, this sense that whatever's inside of you is dangerous, and your safety lives in the AA protocols and the 12 steps, and there may be truth in that. As Jung said, taking hold of the unconscious is, not the first thing you do in trying to help somebody, because it is an uncertain venture. Also, I think that, as in all addictions, there's a feeling that there's something inside of us that is trying to kill us, that wants us to drink this incredible amount or use drugs that is overwhelming the ego. And the part of her that I imagine is now in therapy coming up into the unconscious and is unsure. Am I going to master that? Is this going to master me? Am I going to relapse if I delve too deeply into these potentially overwhelming forces because I know what it's like to be overwhelmed by my impulses? So the first attitude of, yes, interacting with the unconscious, but wanting to retain an awful lot of control and power. It's in the sterilized lab. It has to be almost dead, and then I'm going to grab it and do stuff to it. And I think that's that scary first approach to the world of instincts, which hasn't gone well in the past. So the second image with her, I think, is so encouraging that perhaps at this time that the ego has found its footing, it's strong enough to have just a petting zoo. Just a little liminal tank where you can just look, maybe just touch something. You don't have to jump in the tank, doesn't have to go too far, and just see if the ego is okay, can dance with this and not be gobbled up.
Yes,
that's
it's
great,
lovely.
Joseph. I really like that. And I just want to say, I've sort of had it on my list for a while to talk about Dream series as a podcast topic, and we haven't gotten to it yet. And I don't think I've sold Deb and Joseph on it, but I'm really grateful for this dream because it does show the importance of a dream series, which is another reason to write down your dreams, because then you can track an image like this and how it evolves just in your dreams. I mean, I think this is a really clear example. You can see the psychic growth from these dreams. So let's hear it for Dream Series.
Just a little technological help. Keep it in a Word document or an Excel sheet. You can just type in the word octopus and just see where it indexes across maybe years of dreams, and all of a sudden see that this character has been waving at you for a long time. So technology can help us take hold of these patterns.
Yes, I avail myself of that. So
Yes.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.